Is Grixis Delver back on top? My name is Matt Chow. Let's look at the legacy results from the past week on Magic Online. If you want to check the results from the first week of 2024, check out last week's recap linked in the description. We're going to start with the league results from January 8th to 14th. League results are an incomplete picture of the metagame and their results, as we only get data from lists that finished 5-0. We have no context for what these players were matched against or the total composition of the field. This limits what conclusions we can draw, but I like data, and I find it interesting to look at either way. Turbo Goblins was our most successful deck with 16 copies at 5-0, the same number of results as prior week. This is a slightly higher percentage of the total than during our prior week, but this is due to it being a smaller field than it was last week. Turbo Goblins is still top dog among the Red Ancient Tomb decks, and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Shout out the Goblins Discord folks for continuing to crush. Dimir Scam is next up with 13 5-0 results. It seems that more players are on Scam after the strong results in prelims and challenges from last week. We saw an increase of 6.25 percentage points in results share here. This may even out as the lists and the metagame are tuned to combat this threat. Grixis Delver did see a slight decline in leagues, but it is still highly played and pretty performant. Salty Beans retained essentially the same share, making up 5% of the results. This is a little surprising, given how popular and effective it was last week. Teamer Delver and Moonstompy both had 6 5-0 results. They are present, but smaller parts of the metagame here. 8cast is back with a handful of 5-0s. Last week it didn't have any. Blue-Green White X Beans, or the 4C, 5C Beans decks, remained relatively flat, with 4 copies making it into the data dump. Rhinos, Reanimator Lands, and Doomsday all declined in share, with Rhinos dropping the most week over week. Below that, we have some of the less popular decks: Jeskai, Mono Black, Stifle Knot, D&T, and Initiative. The league results look pretty healthy to me. Goblins and Scam are the most played decks, but both have weaknesses and can be attacked. Moving on to our preliminary and challenge results, we can see a more complete picture. As I've mentioned before, this is where our useful data is found. My view is that conversion rates are the most useful metric when evaluating the efficacy of any given deck. I have added an additional column labeled performance percentage. This is a representation of the same number we see in the versus expected column. It's just shown as a percentage of the conversion rate delta instead of the difference between expected and actual. Simply put, Grixis Delver had a conversion rate of 52.17 compared to the expected rate of 37.39. This is a delta of 14.78%. The 14%-ish number is 39.52% of our expected 37% conversion rate, meaning that it overperformed by roughly 40% relative to what we would have otherwise expected. Please let me know if you find this metric useful when evaluating these results. Looking at Grixis Delver, it was our most played deck in these events, making up 9.5% of the meta, and more than half of its pilots had positive records. I think this is a significant result, with Delver performing at an extremely high level. Teamer Rhinos continues to be a popular deck, making up close to 9% of the field, but underperformed it by nearly 11%. At 8% of the field, Turbo Goblins performed roughly at parity, underperforming by about 1.5%, but I think that's within the margin of error. Scam and Reanimator each made up 7.5% of the field and performed 4% above average or above expected, making them, I think, pretty respectable choices. Boros Initiative and Salty Beans each made up around 6% of the field, both of them underperformed by about 4.5% though. Blue-Green White X Beans made up 4.5% of the field, and it underperformed by a small 2.75% margin. 8cast overall had a good week, comprising 2% of the field. It converted 60% of its players, overperforming by about 60%. Breakfast was also good this week, converting all 3 players into positive records. Lands and Stifle Knot both underperformed by 23.5% and 11% respectively. Continuing the trend of Delver being on fire this week, Teamer Delver overperformed by about 33% while only comprising 1.5% of the field. Last week, I called Paradigm Shift an outlier. Maybe I was wrong. So last week, both pilots converted. Same this week. So 2 pilots were played this deck in prelims and challenges, and this week, again, 2 players played in prelims and challenges. Both times, all players converted. So they had a conversion rate of 100%. So it could be a deck to watch, or it is also possible that these 2 players, or potentially 4. I didn't actually double check, is it the same 2 players or is it not? Are they just really good at this deck? And are they able to leverage a fringe sort of rogue factor with this deck, or is the deck actually something really good? Will this sort of win percentage and this performance rate continue if the sample size were to become larger, if more players picked up this deck? I do think the deck is cool. One of the lists had a white splash for Teferi and Storage to Plowshares, which I really liked. Um, so hard to say. We'll sort of see as that deck evolves, but I do really like that deck. Of the remaining decks, that only converted 1 copy, Doomsday and Sneak pretty heavily underperformed looking at these results. Similar to the league results, I think this is pretty healthy as far as the metagame goes. It will be interesting to see if Grixis Delver can continue to perform this well in the upcoming weeks. Let's close out our week-over-week results and averages in the prelims and challenge results. Something to note is that the averages, I've weighted them by field size. So January 1 through 7 had more players, and it's proportionally weighted at 55.5% compared to this past week, January 8th through 14th. It was a slightly smaller week, and so I've weighted it at 44.5%, totaling 100%. Dimir Scam dropped in popularity by 2% week over week, averaging almost 9% of the field and overperforming its results by about 14.5% overall. Reanimator continues to be highly played, but relatively low performing, making up roughly 8% of the combined field and underperforming by a little bit. Turbo Goblins continues to be a metagame presence with an average metagame share of close to 8% and a positive performance 14.5% above expected. Rhino's increased in metagame share this week by roughly 2%, but its poor showing dragged down its average performance to 4.7% above expected. Last week it was a pretty good deck, this week it wasn't a very good deck. Grixis Delver saw a big uptick in popularity from 5.3% to just under 10%. It also showed up, putting out results, raising its overall performance to 10% above expected. The 4 and 5C Beans decks, they dropped down in popularity, again down to 4.5% of the metagame, and they've continued to underperform, bringing their average representation to 5.5% of the metagame and a performance of 20 points below expected. So not very good here. Again, I sort of talked about this last week, but I think the lack of Triumph of St. Catherine is bringing this deck down on Moto compared to in paper. Triumph of St. Catherine's a really important card for that deck. Boros Initiative has continued to be the second choice among Stompy's players, most of them moving over to Turbo Goblins. It did increase in share by 1%, averaging 5% of the field with a roughly flat performance rate. Salty Beans moved up to almost 6% of the field this week with an average representation across both events of 4.5%. Its results were definitely tempered by a relatively weak showing this week, but it still overperformed on average by almost 25% so far. Temur Delver was much less popular this week, dropping to sub 2% of the field. Lands shed some of its players down to 3% of the field. Moonstompy increased its metagame share very, very slightly. Doomsday slid down to 2% and underperformed the field by almost 45%, so not a very good result there. 8cast continues to make up around 2% of the field. Sort of in closing though, why is anyone playing Sneak and Show? This deck continues to be abysmal. It underperformed on average by 70%, and this is the worst result I've seen out of any archetype so far. Maybe I'm not being fair. Sneak players, please let me know what's going on here, but I just don't really understand why people are playing Sneak and Show right now. Anyways, thanks for letting me share my passion for Legacy data with you. Please let me know what you think, and I'll catch you next time.